In the summer of 1964, Beatlemania firmly landed on U.S. soil. Already famous throughout America from their appearances on Ed Sullivan in February earlier that year, the Beatles' 1964 World Tour brought the supergroup to every major city in America and Canada in the summer. Enter Ivor Davis. Ivor Davis, then writing for the London Daily Express as their West Coast correspondent, was given the assignment of chronicling the Beatles' 64 World Tour and spent 34 days with the band. His book, The Beatles and Me on Tour, is available wherever fine books are sold, and I've put the affiliate link in the description below. In late June of 1964, the Beatles released their third studio album, A Hard Day's Night. 2 months later, they launched their summer tour in San Francisco. A Hard Day's Night featured such hits as And I Love Her, Can't Buy Me Love, and the titular track, A Hard Day's Night. Needless to say, they were at the height of their popularity. Ivor, describe the atmosphere, the mystique surrounding the Beatles, and how it felt being in their presence at this time. Were you starstruck, or was it merely just another assignment?
Well, I didn't know what to expect. As you said, it was an incredible whirlwind tour in the United States and Canada. And also, of course, we were in Vancouver. But I must admit that when I joined the Beatles, all I knew was that they were a hot pop group from England. And I'd seen them in February 1964 on a show called The Ed Sullivan Show. They were magnificent. I mean, everybody screamed. They were sensational, and I was very impressed because 74 million viewers tuned in. So fast forward February 64 to August 64, and I am in San Francisco with the Beatles. I show up at the hotel, at the Hilton Hotel in San Francisco, and I have to fight my way through about 200 girls outside, and I think, what is going on here? Then I meet the Beatles, most amazing 5 to 6 weeks in my life, because I've never seen anything like it. It was like royalty every time we arrived. We got motorcycle escorts. We couldn't leave. Well, we couldn't leave. The Beatles couldn't leave their hotel because there were fans out there all night. And at the stadiums, wherever they played a very short period of time. And I'll ask you if you take a guess at how long they played for. But you could not hear a single word, only because the moment they showed up on stage, the girls started screaming from start to finish.
Let's back up. How did you get this gig in the first place? Who did you kill to get this assignment?
I actually liquidated 12 people. No, kidding. No.
Oh, the Jeffrey Dahmer method.
Yes, exactly. That's the easiest way. Oh, yeah. So what I did was I was West Coast correspondent for the London Daily Express, which was a huge newspaper in England with about 4.5 million readers a day. And those were the days when people actually read newspapers. I don't know if you remember that. You're probably too young to remember that, Russell. But anyway, so I was on the West Coast, and my editor called me and said, get up to San Francisco. The boys are arriving. I said, who are the boys? And he said, they're the Beatles. And they happened to land in San Francisco. I jumped on the plane, got there, and then I was on this, I always say this kind of crazy ticket to ride that I will never forget. And it still comes back to haunt me 50-odd years later.
Describe the access that you were given. What were the boundaries? How much time of the day would you spend with the Beatles?
Well, I must tell you, Russell, the remarkable thing is that there was no limitations. I was in a room next to their suite. Their door was not locked. I could wander in. I helped myself to a drink from their minibar, which Brian Epstein got a bit upset about because he kept complaining. Can you believe this? Brian Epstein, of course, was their manager. He was complaining that the hotel bills at the minibar were too high. I mean, his guys were bringing in $50,000 a concert, and he was complaining about the cost, the use of the minibar. Anyway, to answer your question, I was able to go in, and I was able to hang out with them when I felt like it. I was able to scrounge a drink. At 2 o'clock in the morning, on occasion, John would call me, and Art Schreiber, the Westinghouse radio guy who was on the tour with us, and say, I want to play Monopoly. And we go in at 2 and we play Monopoly. And don't forget, the Beatles were trapped in their hotel. And so they didn't have anybody to talk to. So I was, after about 3 days, a member of the family. You know, they trusted me, and nobody tried to censor me. But I had enough intelligence to realize that if I talked about the possibility that there were underage girls visiting them or even staying with them or doing whatever you wasn't supposed to do, if I'd written about that, I probably would have been asked to jump off the plane and forget it. So the point is that you became so affectionate and so fond of the Beatles, you didn't want to write negative stuff. Not that I saw negative stuff. I mean, there was some funny stuff, but so the rules or the guidelines were never given to me. You just instinctively knew there were things you wrote about and things you didn't write about. And the Beatles, after about a week, were very comfortable in my company, and I was comfortable in their company.
You played a game of Monopoly with the Beatles. How did that go? Who won? And what's your strategy for winning? Do you buy up all the cheap property, or are you a Boardwalk Park Place kind of guy?
Well, I used to buy the waterworks and the electric company because they didn't pay big money, but that was my strategy. Of course, it never worked with John, because John was a cheat. I mean, I say that with affection because he thought when he rolled the dice and he didn't get the number he wanted, he would pretend that he'd accidentally rolled the dice and roll again until he landed on the property. So John was a devastating property tycoon. He loved to win all the hotels, and I don't think he ever pursued that career. I'm kidding you. Anyway, so he cheated. At 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning, he would suddenly stop. We would stop playing the game of Monopoly, and he would pick up the phone and call his wife, Cynthia, in Liverpool. And then Cynthia would put the 9-month-old Julian on the telephone, and for about 3 minutes, John would goo goo gaga, and then he'd hang up, and we'd go back to cheating at Monopoly.
Who won the game, John?
John won the game, but occasionally I was better at poker than him, and I won some money from him. But again, if you keep this to yourself, he never paid, because he always said, and this is true, he never carried money with him. Whenever they wanted anything, they'd ask Mal Evans or Neil Aspinall, their road managers, for money, because they didn't need money. And I want to tell you, if John Lennon, if he paid me what he owed me, today I would have been a rich man.
I've heard that John Lennon was not the easiest person to get along with. Was his public image a facade? And who was most like themselves in public?
Well, John was most like himself in public. Let me tell you, John was vicious, he provoked you, he loved to needle you. He just loved to do it. But he also was very, very funny, with a sharp, sometimes vicious sense of humor. I mean, when I met him, Derek Taylor, their PR guy, said, I wanted to meet Ivor from the Daily Express, and he said, Ivan. I said, Ivor. He said, Ivan the Terrible. I'm going to call you Ivan the Terrible. So that was my nickname with him. So it shows you he wanted to get a rise out of you. But you knew that. When you knew it, you didn't respond that way, and you got along very well. So John was, his mind was lightning fast. He reminded me much later when I interviewed an actor, a comedian called Robin Williams. Remember Robin Williams? Brilliant brain. John and Robin Williams had the same brain that worked in overdrive. I mean, they could be funny, they could do impersonations of people, and John did do it. We were in Cuba. We were in Key West, 90 miles from Cuba, in his hotel room, and we sat watching Fidel Castro, who was then the president of Cuba on television for an hour and a half. And then at the end of it, John turned off the TV and did an impeccable impersonation of Fidel Castro. So that, his mind was all over the place. So he was fun to be with. And did you say he was a bit of a sod? Is that the way you described it?
Well, I've heard that he can be, opinionated. I don't know, taciturn, perhaps?
Oh, I mean, John wasn't taciturn. I mean, he was the performer. He was the guy who would take center stage when you were in the room with him. You didn't have to ask him questions. The guy who would not say much was George Harrison. And George Harrison, unfortunately, was supposed to talk to me every day because I was writing George's column for my newspaper. I ghost wrote George's newspaper column, and George was very quiet, and that was not what I wanted. I mean, he was absolutely terrible. I mean, I hate to use the term surly, but he was a bit surly, because somebody was going to write his column. I didn't want a surly Beatle, did I? So, to be honest with you, John, and all the boys and George slept till 2 PM. They missed my deadline, so I ended up making up George's column, if you don't tell anybody. And then George, after 2 weeks, said to me on the private jet that we were traveling on, that my column that I was writing under his name was a load of old rubbish. He used a stronger description than rubbish. And I said, well, talk to me, George. Start telling me what you're thinking, and it will be better. And we got along much better after that. And Ringo, of course, was the drummer. There's not much you can say about drummers. They make all the noise and the conversation with their drumsticks, I think. He also wasn't, I mean, he had a good wit. All the Beatles had very, 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 very funny personalities. I mean, they were sharp. They could tell that, they could finish each other's sentences. They were so good. And let's see, who have I missed out? Paul. Well, Paul was what he is today. I saw him last year at a concert. He was very amusing. He was charming, and that was the way he always was when I saw him in 1964 and 65 and 66. So he was personable. He'd chat to you. He'd come and sit next to you on the jet. He'd ask if you'd like a gin and tonic or a drink, and then he would go and get it for you. So, he was a charmer, and he still is.
And a renowned philanderer.
A renowned philanderer. Yeah, well, I mean, look, here were these guys, these young guys with very, very healthy libidos. And all of a sudden, they had the key to the Garden of Eden. I mean, John was married, but it didn't stop him, actually. The other boys, well, they were not married. They had a girlfriend. I mean, I think Paul McCartney had the actress Jane Asher in London. But listen, when you've got these lovely, you've got Miss Vancouver, 1964, or Miss Cucamonga coming to see you, and they wanted to hold your hand, who could resist? Brian
Epstein, was he always around? Was he omnipresent, or did you have...
Yeah, he was omnipresent, and he was kind of... this is the ridiculous thing. He was the headmaster, and you could see when... the guys smoked non-stop. They smoked on the plane. They smoked at press conferences. And one day Brian took John aside and said, John, when you're doing a press conference, stop smoking. And then another time I remember he reprimanded John, this is ridiculous, I know, for putting his hands in his pockets when he was talking to somebody doing an interview. So Brian, of course, we knew he was gay. We didn't talk about it. And then, of course, I knew he was a somewhat tortured individual because he would disappear on the tour for several days. And when I said to Derek, where's Brian today? Oh, he had to go to New York for a business meeting or some feeble excuse. But I knew that Brian was off doing what Brian wanted to do. And Brian grew up in a period in England when homosexuality was an arrestable offence. And Brian did get arrested. Brian did get arrested in Liverpool. Brian did get set up by the police for homosexual advances and stuff like that. And he came from a well-to-do family in Liverpool, and the shame and embarrassment of that really scarred him. So you had that, but you've got to give him the credit. Brian was the guy that took these scruffy kids who were performing in Hamburg with greasy hair and leather jackets and smoking during the gig, and he turned them into the clean-cut Beatles that you and I and millions around the world grew to love. So he was the guy that knocked them into shape.
Maybe that's why they started the tour in San Francisco.
Well, to be honest with you, I would say to you, yes, but they weren't there long enough, really. I mean, once we finished San Francisco, after we went, I think it was to Seattle, and then it was, look, you've got to look at it this way. The Beatles were workhorses. I mean, they did 2 performances very often in the same town in a day. The next morning they were off, or the same night they were off. They packed in so much into so many short days that it was amazing. And then the other thing you've got to remember is Brian Epstein had them under a recording contract that made them almost like they were an assembly line of music. They had albums to produce, singles to produce, and so they were working on the tour, and I saw them writing music, John and Paul, on the plane, in the hotel rooms, so that they met their orders, if you like. And so they were working very hard, but they were well trained to work hard, because as the many millions of Beatle aficionados around the world will know this, in Hamburg they worked from about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock in the morning, on stage, non-stop. So they got a good training, if you like. And when they became more famous, they were still working like feverishly, a hard day's night. And that was the Beatles.
8 days a week.
8 days a week. Actually, I counted it was 9 days a week.
Did you watch every concert, every performance?
Yes. Here's what we did. Yeah, I did. And because I was in the front row, Brian Epstein gave me the running order of the songs. And I'm going to ask you this question. I'm sure, I don't want to guess your answer. In 1964, Russell, how long do you think the Beatles performed for at every concert? Make a guess. I'm
going to be honest with you. I know the answer, but if I didn't know, I probably would think 45 minutes to an hour.
Yeah, you probably, when I ask that question, people say 2 hours. The answer, as you know, is 25 minutes, 26 minutes. I mean, can you believe that? I mean, could anybody get away with 26 minutes, 30 minutes concert? Look, I went to see Paul in San Diego, California, about 9 months ago. He performed for 3 hours and 10 minutes. He was on stage non-stop. And it's funny because I said to him, I remember I saw him backstage before the show. I asked him, I said, remember how long you played for on the first American tour? Of course he remembered. I said, how long are you going to play for now, Paul? And he said, you wait and see. And I did, and I timed it, 3 hours, 15 minutes. So that was slight difference. And the other quick slight difference that we had a joke about was in the early days, what happened, Russell, was that the Beatles would travel around England in a beat-up old kind of station wagon type car with no back seat. And today, I asked Paul how many people, and by the way, they had 2 road managers, Mal and Neil. So I said to Paul, I guess you have more road managers than in the old days. How many people, when you travel around the world, do you have? And he said, about 92. And I said, what about the old beat-up, station wagon? And he said, whenever we travel, we have our own jumbo jet. So things have grown up a bit since then.
Watching the live performances, were there many variances in each show, or was it copy and paste each time?
Yeah, and the answer to that question, Russell, is yes, they were copy and paste. But when they did a gig in Kansas City, where they got a lot of money from the owner of the baseball, I forget his name now, but the owner of the baseball team, and he came to see Brian during the tour and said, I'm going to give you quite a huge amount of money. I mean, like $150,000, which is a lot of money back in '64. I mean, what was it today? You do the maths. So when we were in Kansas City, they opened with Kansas City, Here We Come, or whatever the song is. So that was the only deviation. Otherwise, believe it or not, it was exactly the same. They opened and they closed with Long Tall Sally. And I knew that was the reason they closed with Long Tall Sally was that as soon as I heard that, I had to leave the stadium front seat, rush to the second limousine, jump in the back of the second limousine, because as soon as Long Tall Sally finished, the Beatles were out, no encore, nothing else, out into their limo and out of the stadium before you could say Elvis has left the building. They'd gone. And a few times they knew it was dangerous because the fans swamped their limo, so they a couple of times escaped in an ambulance, a meat truck, an armored truck, and did the concert, nothing afterwards. They were gone before the audience stood up.
Were encores common at that time?
Well, I always think, look, I used to go to Las Vegas. Now we're talking, the Fish and whatever. We're talking different. I used to go to Vegas, and I used to go to Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., all the big Tom Jones, and they all did an extra song or two. The Beatles did their 12 songs. That was it. Did
you know of any lip syncing or backing tracks used during their live performances, or was it absolutely live, raw, the real thing?
It was absolutely live, raw. Now, let me tell you, I'm glad you brought that up, because a few times, I mean, even though Ringo knew what the playing order was, because it never deviated, it was always the same. Hard Day's Night, the same songs, finished with Long Tall Sally, and they were gone. But several times, Ringo told me that he lost his way, wasn't sure what song they were playing because the screaming drowned out their music. So I said to Ringo, well, then how did you survive on that? He said, well, I became quite a good lip reader, so I knew what they were singing, and then I could just get back into the rhythm of the song. So there was no deviation, the same songs. It was ridiculous because Brian every night gave us a call sheet. It was the same call sheet. And then in the front row, as I said, we were Long Tall Sally. I was out of there in the limo, number 2, and out of the stadium, the arena, wherever it was.
It is well known the Beatles experimented with LSD and later cocaine and heroin. Did you ever see evidence of heavy drinking or drug use during the tour?
I never saw the effects of drug use, but I was with John on a couple of occasions when I saw him take, and he was quite open about it, preluded, and he called them a prelly, and a prelly is an upper, it keeps you awake, and they did take those. John did particularly. I remember, he didn't hide it in front of some of us, but they did it, and they got used to that when they were in Germany, because in Germany they said, of course, they worked from about 9 o'clock until 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock all night long, and there's no way you can perform for 7 hours non-stop with a few breaks without a little bit of chemical assistance. And the only other time that, they learnt all about marijuana from their good friend, that well-known singer Bob Dylan, who came one day at the end of the tour and introduced them to a high-quality grade of marijuana cigarettes. And then from then on, they were pretty well devoted to marijuana. And of course, as you mentioned a moment ago, I remember the story of George's dentist invited them over for dinner one night and then dropped LSD into their after-dinner tea or coffee. And then they were all floating on the ceiling for the rest of the evening. And then, of course, as you all know, I mean, everybody who knows, follows the history of the Beatles, they got arrested for drugs. John, at one time, was completely zonked out, I think, in the New York period. But they experimented with drugs, and they actually came through it reasonably well, because last time I saw Paul, he was looking very, very good. He's in his late 70s. And then I saw Ringo also a year ago, and Ringo's approaching 80. In his late 70s, and I think he's had a bit of help from his hair. We used to say from a little bit of black boot polish. We used to say in England. So a touch of the boot polishes for Ringo, but he has a trainer that comes in to see him every day, works out with him, and Ringo looks phenomenally well. So even though, I must tell you this, about 20 years ago, Ringo had done a series, a comedy series for kids, something about Ivor the Engine or something for PBS network. And I went to see Ringo in a hotel in Los Angeles with a PBS publicist, and we were there to talk about the show for kids. And Ringo, he saw me, we said hello, we talked about old days, and just as we were going to talk about the show, which is why I came, Ringo started saying, today is my anniversary. Or what's that, Ringo? He said, 14 years, 6 days, and 3 hours sober. Now, you've got to understand, the producer of the children's program was sitting there, and he suddenly sort of turned pale, because Ringo went on at great length to me about how he was proud of the fact that he was on the wagon for so long. So we talked about that, as I say, much to the chagrin of the publicist on the show, on the children's show. And Ringo said, with he and Barbara, his wife, we were so devoted to the bottle that we couldn't leave the house and go on a journey for more than 45 minutes to an hour because we couldn't do without the booze. So Ringo has bounced back from his alcoholism, if you like, and now he looks in phenomenal shape and his mind is good. So long answer to a short question.
The Beatles would return in the summer of '66 for another tour. Why did you not return in the same capacity that you had in the summer of '64? Well,
the answer to that is that it was deja vu for the editors in London. They said, I tell you what you do, Ivor. You're on the West Coast. You're in Los Angeles. Go to see them at the Hollywood Bowl. Hang out with them there, but we don't want you traveling with them again because it's been done before. But so on the period of, there were 5 or 6 days in Los Angeles where I went to a couple of parties and saw them at the Hollywood Bowl. And the glow of touring was off. John was very, very upset because many of the Beatles records had been burnt publicly in the Deep South. Because if you remember, John had made a fairly, he thought, harmless statement to a British pop magazine, which he said the Beatles are more popular than Jesus or something like that. And of course that came back to haunt him in America in 1966. So much so that they were worried about security even more in the Deep South. I remember hearing that John was worried about possibly getting shot, and that dampened, I mean, that's a slight understatement, I know, that dampened the 1966 tour, which was the last tour they ever made in America or anywhere in the world. And they finished in the summer of 1966 in San Francisco. I think it was Candlestick Park, the last concert the Beatles appeared in public. And that was the end. And John said time and again, we are like a bunch of performing fleas. He said, audiences don't come to hear our music, they come to see us, and I don't like that. So after that appearance in San Francisco in 1966, the Beatles as a group performing in front of a large crowd was over. That era had finished. Of course they did, as many fans of the Beatles know, a concert on the rooftop, I think of Abbey Road or somewhere like that. But San Francisco was the end of the road of the touring Beatles. And then not long afterwards, as the world knows, I think it was 1960, or I forget, 67, or thereabouts, it broke up.
The Beatles would famously break up in the fall of 69.
69, okay.
Did you ever sense or witness any divisiveness within the group during your time with the band?
The amazing thing is I did not witness any divisiveness at the time. Of course, I kept in touch with those I knew from the Beatles tour, a few people on the inside who said it all started to turn to rot after Brian died. He was the cement, the glue. He was the headmaster, as I said. He was the arbitrator when they had disputes. And they were a bit tired. George wanted to prove that he was a performer in his own right, and they all did. And then, of course, once Brian died, the furious battle over who was going to run the Beatles took part. And I think it was John, and it was Ringo, and it was George, teamed up with a guy called Alan Klein, a sort of a hotshot a New York manager, who then went to war with Paul McCartney and his family. Paul McCartney had married Linda Eastman, and Linda Eastman's father was a lawyer, her brother was a lawyer, so there were two warring factions, the Eastmans and McCartney, and Lennon, Ringo, George, and Klein, and never the twain shall meet, and it got worse and worse, and so as I said, the rot had set in after the death of Brian, and it never again turned out to be the way it was.
At the beginning of the show, you said your experiences haunt you 50 years later. What experiences haunt you the most, or maybe one particular anecdote?
Well, let me just say that I wouldn't say haunt. The amazing thing is that as a journalist working for a daily newspaper, who all they wanted was tomorrow's story, as soon as I finished with the Beatles, I went on to the next story the next day, which was, I think, the Warren Commission report on the assassination of John Kennedy. So you move on. What kind of haunts me, and it took me a long time to write my memoir about the Beatles and me on tour, because I was working nonstop on so many other big stories in America and around the world. The only thing that haunts me, and this is kind of amusingly haunting, if you like, is the fact that I didn't realize the Beatles would be bigger today than they were then. And what I did was I got every one to sign about 6 to 10 autographed pictures, but I gave them away. And that haunts me because I could have been a rich man if I kept them. Anyway,
or if John had paid off his debt.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. But there's two elements. There's two elements where I could have stopped work and I don't know, become a leisurely guy doing nothing. Anyway, and the other thing I like to say was, back in those days, as a journalist, as a supposedly respectable journalist, you didn't spend your time posing for pictures with the Beatles. I mean, I have something with John. I had something with George. I've got a great group picture with the Beatles, but I never did that. And I always kind of check myself, and I always say, you know, if I knew then, well, I know now, I should have taken my iPhone camera with me.
Well, give me the most outrageous story that you witnessed when you were with the Beatles.
Well, one of the weird stories was there were so many movie stars that wanted to get up close and personal with the Beatles. And the Beatles, all they wanted to meet was Elvis, Bob Dylan, and Burt Lancaster, who they'd seen in a lot of movies. And all the rest of them, you know, Liberace, Shirley Temple, they couldn't care less, really. I know that's strange to say today. So on one occasion, there was an actress named Jane Mansfield, a very voluptuous actress who, that's one way of describing her. Jane was how can I put it delicately, a publicity hogger. She just did everything possible to get PR, and she's very, very, very good at it. She was the Kardashians before the Kardashians came along. Now, so she came to the house and wanted to have pictures with the Beatles, and Brian said no. She was living about 3 blocks away from where the Beatles were renting a house. And she managed to persuade John and the Beatles to come to the Whiskey A Go Go nightclub. She said, to see my friend Johnny Rivers, a singer, perform. So the Beatles went along. Paul was otherwise engaged with a date with an actress. Peggy Lipton was her name. Peggy Lipton was a beautiful actress in a show in America back in the 60s. And she went on to marry Quincy Jones, who was another great performer. Anyway, so the Beatles got suckered into going to the Whiskey A Go Go. So when they got there, they thought it was a private thing, but of course there was a whole ton of paparazzi there because Jane had tipped off the paparazzi that she was coming to the nightclub with the Beatles. 3 Beatles, actually, it says 4. So when we got there, they sat in a big booth and they started getting drunk. At least George started getting drunk and John started getting drunk. And there were photographers sticking cameras up their noses. Literally, I mean, they had those, in those days, they had cameras the size of refrigerators with flash bulbs. And finally, after we'd had a few drinks, George said, would you mind leaving us in peace? Actually, I was there and he said it in somewhat stronger terms, and I just said I could have cleaned it up. And the photographer stuck his camera under George's nose and took another picture. George picked up his drink, and a large drink, and threw it at the photographer and missed the photographer and hit another voluptuous actress who was sitting in the next booth called Mamie Van Doren, also was kind of a second string Jay Mansfield. Anyway, as soon as that happened, the women started screaming, all hell broke loose. The bodyguards came in and lifted the Beatles out of the booth and Jane, and they made an escape out the back door. The next morning, we were on the plane leaving, and somebody gave George a front page of the local paper, the Herald Examiner, the Los Angeles Examiner. And on the front page was a beautiful picture of George tossing the drink at the photographer, which was hugely embarrassing for Brian, as I said, who tried to keep the Beatles in line. And it was a sort of funny, sad, ridiculous story. That's the sort of thing that happened to the Beatles all the time. So they tried to avoid being suckered into the spider's web.
Okay, I've got to ask, I don't know how to segue into it, but I know there's a story in your book about them ritualistically urinating on a pile of used hotel towels.
Yeah, well, what happened was John was particularly pissed off at people taking their bed sheets and tearing them up and selling them. I mean, he hated that. He hated the merchandising thing. I once bought a Beatle wig and proudly showed it to him, and he grabbed it and he threw it out the hotel window. So that was another shilling he owed me, or $1 he owed me, and he never paid me for that. And I wake up every morning crying, realizing that John owed me so much. Anyway, so on one occasion, they heard from somebody that they were going to, I forget where it was Seattle or somewhere, maybe, anyway. And I think it was really John that did it, to be honest with you, but they said, well, one way to stop people capitalizing on us is to destroy the evidence. And so they went into the bathroom and gently urinated on a few of the towels, hoping that the odor would drive the ambitious hucksters away, and then they left. And that was the story of the wet towels.
Gee. Have you seen the movie Yesterday?
Yes, I have.
What did you think of that? What a fantastic premise, right?
Yes, it was a fantastic premise, and I must say it was well acted, and the music was great. I loved the story. It was kind of funny, that you can imagine. Everybody's memory had been wiped out by this strange event, and except for this young man, who, as you remember in the film, Russell, he doesn't want to capitalize. He knows the Beatles, but he gets dragged into it, doesn't he? And that's part of the charm. And I think Paul said he liked the film, and for those who, I don't want to spoil it for those who have not seen it. It's been out a few years. For those who've not seen it, of course, one of the Beatles makes a surprising entry into the film, which you wouldn't know about. I mean, do you want to tell your audience?
I'm okay with it. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie Yesterday, watch it first, because we're going to spoil something here. So go ahead.
No, I think, I guess the charming thing is that John Lennon goes up as an old man in the film. And it's quite nice. But don't forget, when you go into a dark room in a cinema, your credibility level has to evaporate for you to appreciate a film very often. And this is the case with Yesterday. And it's okay in a fable to show that John Lennon is still alive, living in obscurity somewhere on Earth.
My favorite scene was where him and Ed Sheeran are having a competition as to who can write the better song in 24 hours. Ed Sheeran does a great number, and he responds with "The Long and Winding Road."
Winding Road. Oh my God! And Ed Sheeran, it looks like somebody's hit him with an axe or a sledgehammer. Whoa, that's not bad.
Yeah, one of the greatest songs ever written.
Yes, I know. Yeah, well, that was part of the charm of the film, wasn't it?
Yeah. You know, you've interviewed many famous people, obviously. How would you rank your experience with the Beatles compared to other celebrities you've worked with? I mean, have you immersed yourself into the life of another celebrity as much as you had with the Beatles?
Well, the answer to that is not really, although in writing, I mean, I've covered Hollywood for 40 to 50 years, and I've interviewed characters, great personalities like Muhammad Ali and Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Robin Williams. The Beatles have survived for so long. I mean, before you and I started this conversation, I was listening to a friend of mine and a very great guy called Chris Carter, who in Southern California has breakfast with the Beatles for 3 hours every Sunday morning. And I want to tell you, Chris is a trip for me down memory lane. And he has people my age. He has their children, their grandchildren listening to Beatle music. So the impact of the Beatles is like no other, really, because their music lives on. The Beatles, Ringo and Paul, as you know, are still performing. And I think nothing, in retrospect, matches the endurance, the longevity, the charm of their music. And you can hear their music anytime. And when I listen to the songs, it brings back a lot of memories. So I don't think, I'm not an introspective kind of guy. I've had to be as I've grown older and when you write a book. But I think when you think of what the impact of the Beatles is, I mean, my grandkids now know all about the Beatles. I don't think they know a thing about Paul Newman and Robert Redford and Elizabeth Taylor. They know Muhammad Ali. But the longevity, the endurance, the memories continue to be lively, active, passionate today as they were 50-odd years ago.
The day John Lennon died, how was that for you? I imagine you remember where you were when you heard the news.
Oh, yes. Somebody called me. Communications then was not as crazy as it is today because somebody dies in Vancouver, Canada, and if you're in London, you hear about it within less than a minute. Somebody called me up, and I couldn't believe it, but what kicked into me at the time was not again, because I don't know if I ever told you, but I was in the kitchen the night that Bobby Kennedy was shot. So I that was very vivid. And then
what do you mean? You were in the kitchen. What do you mean?
Yeah, I was covering Bobby Kennedy's campaign, his campaign for president in June of 1968. And I'd been traveling with him for a week. And I went to the hotel with him because he was going to declare victory and win all the electoral votes for California and go on to Chicago, where the Democratic Party would have nominated him to be president. So I was in the kitchen. I was following him through. I heard balloons popping, 5, 6, 7. And then I thought, oh, that's balloons. And then I heard screaming, women screaming. And I pushed my way into the pantry, and there on the floor was Bobby, bleeding. Ethel, his wife, had put the straw motor under his head, try and lift his head up a bit. It was crazy. It was screaming. It was not again. Oh, no. It was bedlam. And Bobby was taken to hospital, as the world knows, and 26 hours later, he was dead. So I've sort of gone off path a bit here, but the point I was trying to make was, so I saw Bobby Kennedy moments after he was shot. I was a reporter. I was in Santa Monica, California, when I heard that John Kennedy had been shot. And the same year, 68, as I saw Bobby in the kitchen, months before, Martin Luther King had been shot in a Memphis motel. So, you know, the answer to your question is you're horrified when people get shot in, but you just say, oh my God, will this never end? Will this senseless assassination ever end in America? And that kind of, it didn't soften the blow, but I thought, oh my God, here we go again.
That's poignant. Thank you for that. Well, I leave the audience on a tragedy.
I'm afraid so. But you did bring it up.
What's your favorite Beatles song?
Well, I always say Long Tall Sally, which the Beatles didn't write, but because I never got a chance to hear it at the very end, because I was in the limo by the time the song was halfway through. I had to help them make a getaway. But I mean, everyone you mentioned, The Long and Winding Road, Let It Be, Hey Jude, those songs. And I like, oh, by the way, one of my favorites is Working Class Hero by John Lennon. And it's really because it's a guttural, visceral song about John. And I think he wrote it shortly after he had undergone primal therapy with Yoko Ono in Los Angeles. I forget the name of the album that they put it out. You're probably better at this than me. But Working Class Hero is John talking about himself from the guts out, and it's very powerful.
The Beatles and Me on tour. Of course, this and so many other stories are in the book. Anything on the horizon, Ivor? A new book in the works, perhaps? I mean, you are the fly on the wall.
Yeah, I must. Maybe we'll talk about this another time, Russell. But last summer, I wrote my book about the Charles Manson murders because, again, I had been there from day one. I covered the trial. I saw Manson in action. I interviewed Roman Polanski, the husband of the murdered movie star Sharon Tate, and for 50 years I covered that story, and I wrote a book about it called Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. So I'm staying fairly busy, but the only thing I want to add, and I don't know if we have time to add this final thing, it's a small world. It's a 6 degrees or 3 degrees of separation. Because when I covered the Manson murders and spoke to members of his entourage or his group who were not involved in the killings, he told me a story I could not believe. This is 1969. I was with the Beatles in 64. In 1969, they said, Charlie Manson used the Beatles songs from the White Album of 1968 to try and brainwash his followers that the Beatles were sending him secret messages in the White Album, Revolution, Helter Skelter, Piggies, songs that he claimed were telling him there was going to be a black-white revolution, rivers of blood, but Manson would escape. And supposedly Manson used this to use the murders of Sharon Tate and the La Biancas in the summer of 1969 to explain why he set them out to kill. Now, so all of a sudden, it was me 5 years later hearing these amazing stories about the Beatle lyrics, which I knew, of course, didn't incite a riot. Of course, it was absolute balderdash. So anyway, long answer to a short question. So I ended up writing my new book, and it done pretty well. And there we are. So the Beatles feature in the new book.
Ivor Davis, always good chatting with you. Wow, you're very sharp. Good show. Thank you so much for being a guest on the program again. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Russell. Stay well.